everybody. Welcome to my second podcast. In this podcast, I'll be covering the period of 1960 to 1965. My first podcast was for the period of the Asian communities in Southall for the period 1950 to 1960. And I want to recap some of the points that I made in that podcast. By about 1951, there were about 300 Asians in Southall, and by the end of that decade, there were only 2 shops in Southall. So by the beginning of 1960-1961, there were about an estimated 2,200 Asians, mostly Punjabi, Sikhs and single men living in Southall. There were only a few children, and in 1961, for example, there were a recorded 55 Asian children in Beaconsfield Primary School. Remember that Beaconsfield Primary School was in the catchment area called, at that time, Hamborough Ward, where most of the Asian community that came as migrant workers settled in. By about 1961, there were about 4 to 5 Asian shops only in Southall. From the period of 1960 to 1965, the Asian community grew substantially, and I'll go into the reasons why it grew. So by the end of 1965, there had been a dramatic increase in the Asian population. The population had increased to about 6,500 over the 5-year kind of period. Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Balraj Purewal, and this is the second podcast that I'm doing on the subject of Asians of Southall. This particular podcast will cover the period 1960 to 1965. In my previous podcast, which covered the period 1950 to 1960, I went through the kind of issues, the life at that time. This podcast will look at a couple of areas. One of the areas is around the increasing and emerging Asian community, the issues in kind of education, in housing, and the introduction of the first immigration laws in this country. To recap, as I said in my earlier podcast, in the 1950s, but in 1951, for example, there were only 300 Asians in Southall and 2 Asian shops in Southall. By the beginning of 1960, the Asian community population had increased, and by about 1961, there were an estimated 2,250 Asians, mostly Sikhs, mostly Punjabis, and mostly single men. There were only about an estimated 55 Asian children, primarily at Beaconsfield Primary School. Beaconsfield Primary School was located in the catchment area known as the Hamborough Tavern, in which the majority of the Asian migrant workers, the early settlers, settled in. By about 1961, from the 2 shops in the 50s, we now had about 4 or 5 Asian shops in Southall. By about 1965, the population had increased to 6,500, mostly Punjabis, 90%, but there were about 400 Pakistanis, also primarily Punjabis, in Southall. And the children population had increased from 55 in 1961 to about 1100 by 1964. By 1965, the number of Asian shops in Southall had increased to about 10 to 12. I want to give you a sense of what life was like in Southall in the 1960s. Firstly, it was really cold. The weather was really cold. For example, I remember that in 1962, we had one of the coldest winters on memory. In fact, so cold that even the River Thames froze. In those days, in the 60s, there wasn't central heating. There were only coal fires, so people had to bring in coal from their gardens, start the coal, and it led to a lot of smoke, etc. The street lights were also powered by gas, and they were usually lit up in the evenings. Every house, was kind of overcrowded generally. So you had a situation where in almost every room was used as a bedroom, and you had on average anything between 8 to about 12 men or 2 to 3 families living in what was a standard small 3-bedroom house in those days. Most of the Sikhs that came here wore turbans, but when they came here, they had to have their haircuts in order to get a job. So it was compulsory. They didn't have a choice. If they wanted to work, they had to have a haircut. Most of the Asian workers at that time were forced to work 12-hour shifts or night shifts, and often 7 days, 6 days a week. The average weekly wage in the early 60s was between £7 and £8 a week, and workers were paid in cash. The other thing common in those days was that every Asian knew about the rubber factory, because that was a factory where most Asians could get a job. Basic Asian foodstuffs like dal, atta, rice was brought in from East London, the Aldgate areas where we had a large Asian Punjabi population, and some businessmen would bring those essential dals, rice, atta via vans into Southall and kind of sell it house to house. They had a list of all the people that were living in Southall. The other interesting things are that shops and businesses like banks used to close half days on Wednesdays, half days on Saturdays afternoons, and on Sundays were closed all day. The general food people consumed was mostly vegetarian, and on weekends there was a kind of a tradition of having meat on weekends only. Men wore suits when going out. It was something they'd been kind of told to look smart so that the English community wouldn't think of them in a negative way. A letter to India, used to be airmail letters in those days, would take about 2 weeks getting to India, and then a response would be received 2 weeks later on. So effectively took on average about a month to communicate with families back home. There were no telephones in those days in people's houses. What we had was public kiosks, those red telephone kiosks, and they were only situated on the main street. So in Southall, I think we had about 2 or 3, one on the Broadway and one on South Road. The TV at that time, very few people had TVs. And the general trend was to rent, if people had by about 65, to kind of rent a TV. And there were only 2 channels, BBC and ITV. BBC Two wasn't launched until about 1964. So the price of houses at that time ranged from about £1,000 in 1960 to about £2,000 by about 1965. The local pubs had usually 2 bars, a public bar for what was working class people and a saloon bar. In the saloon bars, you basically wore a suit and tie in order to get entry. Mostly it was reserved for white people, and working class people were, and the immigrants went into the public bar. In terms of cars, hardly any Asians. I would have a guess that probably about 3 to 5 Asians owned a car in 1960, 1961. In terms of the money, the currency that operated, what we had was a £5 note, a £1 note, a 5 shillings note, which was equivalent to half a pound, and then we had a shilling, a florin, which was kind of a 6p coin, 3p coin, 1p coin, and a half p coin. Milk used to be delivered by vans on a daily basis to people's houses every morning. And one of the things that I remember vividly in the 60s, that most of the Asian kind of parents, their mantra to their children was, like we say, education, education, education. It seemed as though everybody wanted their child to be either a doctor or an engineer. And our early settlers, the early migrants, had very little knowledge of the culture, the language, the lifestyle of the English kind of community here. So along with this difficult kind of social, cultural climate, our early kind of settlers were subjected to horrendous living conditions, dehumanizing kind of treatment, racial abuse, and these were daily occurrences, and I shall kind of go into them kind of later on. Generally speaking, our elders were seen in effect as second-class citizens. The period from 1960 to 1965 witnessed some of the most hostile and racist responses and campaigns against our presence in Southall. In fact, there was open and extreme hostility towards our presence in Southall and to Asians moving in to Southall. White residents by the early 60s, started protesting and campaigning to stop Asians moving into Southall and buying houses. In 1963, for example, hundreds of white residents petitioned Ealing Council and campaigned to try to get the Ealing Council to stop Asians buying houses in Southall and demanded that the council take action. The campaign slogan was, we don't want Indians, we want peace on our streets. Their campaign slogan was also, stop the silent invasion. In 1963, you'll be surprised that white residents on Palgrave Avenue forced the council to buy a house on their street which was up for sale to prevent Asians buying that house. So the council was forced to buy a house and it remained empty for some time just to prevent an Asian family buying this house. The other thing that the council did was it introduced what was then called a 15-year rule, which meant that Asians who were the recent arrivals could not access council housing because they had to be in Southall, in Ealing, for 15 years before even being considered. Basically, in effect, white people wanting to sell their houses, their neighbors, local residents on the whole street, combined with the white estate agents, the banks, building society, and mortgage lenders, they all began to connive to prevent Asians from buying houses. So it was an open secret that white people weren't going to sell their houses to Asian, and that mortgage lenders weren't going to grant mortgages to Asians. So what Asians had to do was to kind of club together because they couldn't get the mortgages to raise the funds. Secondly, they were often forced to pay higher prices. Some people even had to bribe mortgage lenders to get the paperwork through. One of the things that the council did was that it changed its rules on overcrowding and started targeting and harassing Asian families, undertaking unannounced raids on Asian houses under the pretext of health and safety concerns. For example, in 1963 alone, the council served over 400 notices, and only against Asians, to threaten them and try to force them to evict their relatives and their friends, which created fear and panic. A lot of uncertainty amongst Asian families and households, many of whom had nowhere else to go. These kind of factors forced Asians to live together and almost suffer some of the most appalling and overcrowded kind of conditions. Asians were forced and driven into living in poorer neighborhoods and then blamed for creating ghettos and not integrating. One of the issues that happened as a consequence of this kind of hostility was that white parents started campaigning that there were too many Asian children in Beaconsfield primary schools. They stoked fear and resentment and racism against our children and our communities. Whereas the reality, in fact, was that in 1961, for example, there were only 55 Asian children in primary school. And by 1963, in Beaconsfield primary school, it had reached the 130, which was effectively only about 15% of the whole school population. In spite of these low numbers of Asian children in Beaconsfield Primary School, white parents protested, they argued that their school was being swamped, like they said, by Asians. They argued that the presence of Asian children in their school undermined the education of their children. They demanded that Asian children be dispersed from Beaconsfield Primary School and be taught in separate and segregated classes. English families also started moving out of Southall because of our presence. So in effect, our children were set up and seen as a problem. For example, and I've got a quotation here, in 1963, the mayor of Southall made a statement saying that, and I quote, "Sikh parents should encourage their children to give up their turbans, their religion and their dietary laws. If they refuse to integrate, then we must be tough. They should be told that they would be the first to go if there was unemployment." These sentiments were picked up nationally, and the Education Secretary, for example, the infamous Edward Boyle, he spoke in Parliament in 63 and he made a statement. And the statement was, and I read again, it said, "I must regretfully tell the House that one school," and he referred to Beaconsfield School, "must be regarded now as irretrievably an immigrant school. The important thing to do is to prevent this happening elsewhere." Now, this is the statement of the Education Secretary at the time. Given this context, the government commissioned what was called a Plowden report, which almost embraced the hostility against immigrant children, and it legitimized the adoption of a racist policy, which was the dispersal of Asian children, of immigrant children in schools. The Plowden report basically reported that where concentrations of non-English speaking children reaches a level which interferes with the opportunity for other children, there may be a demand for dispersal. What that meant was the racist policy of dispersal and busing of Asian and black children was born. And this policy of busing and dispersal effectively boiled down to a formula which was that where there were more than 33 and 1/3% of immigrant school children in any one class, dispersal and busing should be introduced. Now, the first phase of dispersal was between 62 and 1963, and primarily of primary school children in Beaconsfield Primary School, where children were sent to other schools. I was one of the first batch of primary school children to be dispersed. I went to Beaconsfield Primary School in 1964. I was dispersed. I was separated from my brother and sent to Tudor Road Primary School due to the racist policy of dispersal. At Tudor Primary School, I was put in a separate class, an Asian-only class, segregated from the rest of the school and taught by an Asian teacher. Other schools started segregating Asian children as well and teaching them in separate classes, often in temporary huts and away from the main school buildings. Later on, Asian children, often as young as 5-year-olds, started being bussed out of Southall to schools throughout Ealing. Older children from about 12 years onwards of secondary school age were effectively forced to make their own way by bus to other schools, many having to travel 5 to 7 miles each day to get to school. Immigrant children under this policy were isolated and put in what were called special classes, and playgrounds, as you can imagine, became battlegrounds of what was an unfair war, where the majority of white children would kind of be on one side, a lot of bullying, a lot of attacks, a lot of beating up, etc. So against the few immigrant children that ventured into these kind of schools out of Southall. So immigrant children, you can imagine, huddled in small groups fearing for their safety. In a sense, it was pure tribalism. So you had taunting, fights, name-calling became the norm. Head teachers and teachers would further add to this abuse by punishing Asian children, calling in inspectors, writing bad reports, and even giving detentions. And the problem with detention was that many of our children, because they were subjected to detentions, often to miss the buses home. And the buses were basically called and labeled as Paki buses. Busing also meant traveling was exhausting for majority of our children. Parents had to collect children from schools that were far away. And if parents were ill, they were unable to go and pick up their kind of children. They didn't have the cars either. Parents often complained about racial bullying that their children had to suffer. And majority of these complaints were ignored, not investigated, or else the child was made out to be as the problem. The government effectively supported, sanctioned, and legitimized a policy of institutional child abuse. On the one hand, the government was arguing that dispersing immigrant children to white schools would help immigrant children to integrate and adopt the English way of life. On the other hand, schools, our children were being segregated from other classes instead of mixing with the other school children. One of the things about busing is that not a single white child was ever bused into Southall. So during 1960 to 1965, this sets one of the scenes that affected our communities, and the hostile environment in education to our presence was then kind of picked up in immigration. So in the 1950s and early 1960s, Britain had actively encouraged immigration, particularly from the Commonwealth countries, because Britain desperately needed cheap labor for its post-war reconstruction and development. And before 1962, there in fact were no immigration controls, because under the 1948 British Nationality Act, all of us were in effect British citizens. From 1960 onwards, however, the hostility, the resentment, the opposition to the presence of colored immigrants stoked and fueled this racist political narrative and discourse. So what you had was Labour, Tory, Liberal, trade unions, along with the so-called public institutions and professions, government, education, social services, etc., together developing a discourse, a political professional solidarity, which tried to justify setting us up as a problematic presence and use that to stop us colored immigrants coming into this country. In response to the overwhelming hostility and demand to stop black immigration, the government introduced the first Immigration Act in 1962. Now, the interesting fact about this is that the first Immigration Act of 1962 was specifically to control black immigrants, because it only applied to people coming from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Ghana, and Nigeria. Under this Immigration Act, the government introduced the need for people coming in to apply for work permits before they came in. One of the things that the debate around the introduction of the 1962 Immigration Act, it created panic and uncertainty. Those already settled here started mobilizing, rushing to bring their families before the introduction of the new act, because they feared that under this new act there would be a total ban of all immigrants and they wouldn't be able to bring in their kind of families. So from 1960 to 1965, the Asian population in Southall trebled. And the single men who were already settled here or working here started bringing their families over. By 1965, for example, the government tightened the immigration laws even further and limited the number of work permits that were being issued. So the introduction of, and the debate around the introduction, the hostility to colored immigrants, fueled the increase in population, or the Asian population in Southall. This led to Asian communities beginning to reorganize themselves. So in terms of the discrimination in the factory, Asian workers began to take a fight back against the massive discrimination and exploitation that was happening in kind of factories at the time. Trade unions had been supporting previously factory owners and management to maintain what were horrendous, unacceptable, and discriminatory practices, where Asian workers, for example, were paid lower wages than white workers, colleagues, who were doing the same jobs. Asian workers were particularly subjected to unsafe and often dangerous working conditions. They were forced to work 12-hour shifts, 6 days and often 7 days a week. When Asian workers challenged or refused to work these working conditions, they were routinely sacked unfairly and never or hardly ever supported by trade unions. In 1965, Asian workers organized one of the first Asian strikes in Rockware glass factory in Greenford. That was followed by Asian workers mobilizing and organizing to take action against the unfair working practices at E02 factory in Southall. In November 1960, 600 Asian workers walked out on strike in the rubber factory and took on both the factory management and the trade union. Now, the rubber factory, which was central to the economic well-being of our Asian communities, was central to the Asian communities and had a devastating impact, as a majority of our people relied on and worked at the rubber factory. They had no option. There was a lot of fear, I remember, at the time, because most of these workers had to provide for their families, their children, both here and back in India. So we are beginning to move into the realms of Asian workers, Asian communities, beginning to respond to this kind of blatant, overt, horrendous, hostile environment and racial discrimination. They're beginning to organize and speak up against being treated as second-class citizens. They begin to lay the foundations, politically and economically, as well as culturally, which was essential, they felt, to the survival, not only of their survival, but also to that of their children and to the future of their children. So that against all the odds, during this period, Asians started to set up their own businesses, and the number of shops in Southall, the number of houses that they bought began to increase dramatically. By 1965, the Punjabis in particular, had set up the first Gurdwara. During this period, the first masjid had also been set up, and two of the most famous restaurants had been launched. The famous TKC on the Broadway, run by the Chowdhury family, and the famous Saggu and Thakka restaurant on the Green. During this period, the Indian Workers Association also purchased the Dominion Center, and many of you will remember that, and started showing Bollywood films. This paved the way for Asian families to have the first social outlet. During this period, the Asian communities started, in effect, the political fight back. They started organizing local and national political campaigns against unjust practices and laws. they started organizing, raising a voice to demand justice, dignity, equality, and justice. They started to say words like, we will not be treated as second-class citizens. We want equal rights and justice. So during this period, our elders and our parents began planting the seeds of the movement from which Southall was to emerge as the capital of Asian communities, as the cultural, the social, the political and economic powerhouse of Asian communities in Britain. They began during this period our fight back for basic human rights. Join me in my next podcast. My podcast is held on the first Sunday of each month. I hope you enjoy this podcast. I look forward to talking to you all at the next podcast. See you then. Bye.